Welcome to the Cinematologist Podcast. I'm Dario. I hope you're suitably warm in whatever genius ways people are finding to do that at the moment. And obviously not paying thousands of pounds for the privilege, but I don't think there's any avoiding that. I don't mean to be flippant here. The politics of staying warm is an existential question for many of us in the current political malaise. But the last week has been perfect weather for a remake of Ice Station Zebra or a spin-off Star Wars for that matter, probably called something like Hoth Diaries. I'm bringing this up not because of that British affectation to start all conversations on the subject of the weather, but because it's just another of the multitudinous challenges to cinema going. I'm sat here recording this intro in Picture Houses Central. I'm about to go in and see Aftersun, directed by Charlotte Wells. And this is with my Black Friday purchased Picture Houses membership. And I was thinking about how to introduce today's interview. And again, the recurring theme of cinema going, that's in the context of the COVID pandemic and well before that. It's definitely been a recurring theme on the podcast. I'm not being paid to evangelize about picture houses by any means. And it's certainly a privilege to be able to drop £100 just like that on a yearly membership. But with 10 free tickets and other various discounts, it did strike me as a genuine bargain for someone who goes to the cinema as much as I do. And for me, it's not just about the films themselves. When it's a really great venue with a spacious bar or a restaurant and just a nice environment to prepare yourself for the cinema going experience, the whole holistic process is actually quite a central part of my life when I think about it. Don't get me wrong, the auditorium experience is too. Indeed, the older I get, the more I think that in the context of so much digital distraction, I'm increasingly sympathetic to what might seem the rather archaic sensibility that cinema is a specific environment which manifests a unique experience of cognitive and embodied immersion, one that can't be fully replicated elsewhere in any other viewing environment. There are obviously a long line of thinkers who have written about the cinematic apparatus, or use the more nuanced term, the cinematic dispositif, going back through film philosophers such as Jean-Louis Baudry, Christian Metz, Vivian Sobchak, David Roderick, Deleuze and Guattari, and Raymond Belleur. I'm not forgetting, of course, Francesco Cassetti's book, The Lumiere Galaxy, which I think is very good on reckoning with these debates about what we mean when we say the cinematic experience in the digital age. But the subject does go beyond the mere question of whether it's experientially better to watch films in the cinema. I remember back in the early days of the podcast, one of the main reasons for doing the show down in Falmouth was to try and get the students to come to screenings. There were lots of reasons, of course, why they didn't come. And my attempts to get students to come to screenings in my new university this semester has had many of the same issues, whether it's to do with the value of the screening to the subject being taught, which sounds counterintuitive, but that's an excuse I've heard. Watching at home is better than watching in the auditorium, which again, we've discussed with the students this term. Out and out laziness, which can't be discounted, and which is kind of more problematic for film students, the fact that many don't possess what I would call a deep cinephile curiosity. It's a sad fact, I'm afraid. We've talked a lot on the podcast about the wider subject of the differentiation between what we might call mainstream cinema-going audiences now and the way that they demarcate between films that are deemed worthy of a visit to the cinema and those that are not. I'm speaking pretty much from a speculative standpoint here. One, granted, that's reacting to articles that have been written quite regularly about the problems of getting people generally to come back to the auditorium. Another such article popped up on my social media feed this week, written in the New York Times by Brooks Barnes. It talked about how critically acclaimed middlebrow to highbrow films that were aimed at awards recognition failed to garner enough box office to justify them being made in the first place. The question of whether prestige films are economically viable for theatres and the fact that streaming is blamed for this, essentially. It kind of embeds the idea that the notion of the cinematic, in scare quotes, now only really means big budget franchise spectacle movies. Just to quote from the article, he writes, "One after another, films for grown-ups have failed to find an audience big enough to justify their cost. Armageddon Time cost roughly $30 million to make, and the market collected $1.9 million at the North American box office. Tar cost at least $35 million, including marketing. Ticketing sales totaled $5.3 million. Universal spent around $55 million to make and market She Said, which also took in $5.3 million. Devotion cost well over $100 million and has generated $14 million in ticket sales. And even The Fabelmans, based on Mr. Spielberg's Adolescence, has collected $5.7 million in 4 weeks of limited play. Its budget was $40 million, not including marketing." So the writer thinks that Hollywood is failing to come to terms with its own irrelevancy when it comes to these prestige movies. In contacting studio executives, the article says that they just got back anodyne answers about executives being proud of their prestige work. Interestingly though, lower budget art house films still find a cinephile audience, on a much smaller scale of course, but they have smaller budgets to begin with. The people who listen to this kind of podcast, for example, would probably agree that the cinephile culture is much more akin these days to the ecosystem of theatre. There's also the argument that mainstream cinema audiences find dramatically introspective films too depressing. And again, related back to the kind of bombardment of digital content that we all have to navigate, you could argue that escape, in quotes again, is the underlying state that consumers are searching for. So paying money to take 2 or 3 hours out of your day just to be further depressed is not something that many people want to do. And then there's, of course, the notion of cost. I remember seeing online discussion around National Cinema Day back in September. Many cinemas doing £3 tickets, and lots of people commenting on just how full the cinemas were. But in this climate, it's no wonder that exhibitors in the mainstream end are always looking for the next big saviour. Top Gun Maverick was obviously the big one this summer, and the discourse around it having to be seen in the cinemas because it was so spectacular was more around its action possessing a material weight, unlike the flimsiness of many CGI-heavy productions, and of course, a heavy dose of nostalgia. So that brings us to today's interview. I talked to Chris Cassingham, who is studying for an MA in Film Curation at NFTS. I met him a couple of times at our regular screenings at the Garden Cinema, and we talked about his graduation film series, which is entitled Beyond Interpretation, and it focuses on what he calls marginal American cinema, as opposed to independent cinema, which is obviously a subject that we get into in the interview. But we also contextualise the conversation with regards to some of these issues that I've talked about in this introduction. And we discussed the disruptive politics of counter or even anti-mainstream programming. And also, with the resonances of the films that he has chosen, the current zeitgeist of paranoia, anxiety, and conspiracy theory. So that interview is coming right up. But before that, I just needed to plug our final live screening and recording. This takes place in the Garden Cinema again, in Covent Garden. If you haven't been down there, it's really worth checking out, even if it's on another film as opposed to our screening night. But we are showing Blood Simple on Tuesday the 20th of December at 7 p.m. Coen Brothers' directorial debut, of course. And I'm going to be joined by producer-director James Dean, who you might remember from the first episode of this season when we were up in Manchester with Caroline Katz. He picked the film as it's one of his favourites. So if you're a true cinematologist and a cinephile and an ardent believer in the cinema-going experience who happens to be around London on the 20th, I'd love to see you down there. But for now, let's move into the main part of the episode. This is me talking to Chris Cassingham about film curation.
Yeah, we caught up when you came to the last screening of Irma Vep. That's right, isn't it? And so it was nice to meet you there. And I know you've been following the show a little bit.
Well, yeah, I've sort of come to the show pretty recently. I went to your Cape Fear taping at the Garden a couple months ago, and that was my first exposure to the podcast. And so I was like, whoa, if they're getting together these screenings of these types of films, I'm in. So yeah, just had my eye out on the various screenings you're putting on with the Garden. and really, have really enjoyed them.
Right.
But I guess maybe we'll talk about this, but I came to your podcast slightly more officially through some research I was doing for this grad project.
Right.
You had done an interview with one of the directors of a film in my grad project, and I was like, oh, these are the guys from those screenings at the Garden. I was like, oh, we have even more similar interests.
Yeah, so it's kind of a small cinematic world in many respects when things like that.
It very much
happens.
so.
Yeah. So you just flown back to the States, am I right? Whereabouts are you exactly?
I'm just outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is, if that's unfamiliar, I'm about an hour and a half north of Chicago.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I mean, geography is not my strong suit anyway, but sort of states of the United States, I could probably be better on, that's for sure.
Way up north in the U.S., bordering Canada.
You know, we had a chat because you have curated this season that's coming up at the ICA as part of your MA degree. I mean, I'm assuming it's kind of your big final project, as it were. But maybe you could say a little bit about that, because obviously, Neil and I both work in universities, and NFTS is, a big organization in the landscape of film education. So, I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to be interested in this sort of field of cinephilia, of film organization and administration, I suppose it's part of. But, we've talked a lot on the show about curating. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about NFTS and the curating course.
Yeah, so I came to the NFTS really through not chance per se, because I was on the lookout for something like this MA course that the NFTS offers. But I'd been 2 years removed from university. I was out working in the real world, really not enjoying what I was doing. And it was sort of the mixture of the pandemic hitting, me having relatively recently quit my job. I was working in state government, just a government hack, essentially. And
is that in the US?
In the US, yeah. I was working in Virginia, which is where I went to school. But yeah, so it was a confluence of those two things, and my really growing, cinephilia, which I was using as sort of my coping mechanism against this awful job that I hated. It really was just a matter of almost like Googling what are the educational opportunities that might align with these kind of burgeoning interests. And the MA course at the NFTS came up. I had never seen anything like it. Obviously, there are lots of master's courses in film studies, but the kicker was programming and curation, which is alongside the film studies course here at the NFTS. So it was it was just something I had never seen before, and I really applied almost really a week later. This was June 2020. And I applied as quickly as I could, essentially, and had an interview in August, and I was accepted by September. So it was an extremely quick turnaround.
Right. Did you always want to kind of study abroad, or was it were you looking in the US as well?
I was looking in the US, but there really is nothing like this course in the world, really. I believe Birkbeck does something similar, but it's certainly not in the US. There's nothing like this.
Sure.
So yeah, the notion of studying abroad came afterwards, although I guess maybe subconsciously I had an interest, but it wasn't at the forefront. But yes, but since coming to the NFTS, it's been just a dream, really. It's endlessly fascinating course, really puts the practicalities at the forefront, which for someone whose very minimal exposure to film studies before this course was very theoretical. So the practical element of the course has been just a steep learning curve, but an exciting challenge.
It's interesting to me in terms of what the core content would be. And, you're sort of talking about the practical applications. I mean, and we've talked about the word curation on the podcast. And, if you kind of reduce it down, you could almost just sort of say what it implies is just picking something that you like to watch. But clearly there's more to it than that. So, what are the key factors in curation for you and what do they teach you about it in NFTS?
Well, yeah, you're at the very basic level. You are sort of right. Curation really is at the maybe deep down. It is essentially picking things you like to put on and hoping that other people will be interested in as well. And I guess that's the key part, is the hoping that other people will be interested as well. And that's what the NFTS has really focused on, is the audience awareness. You have to know who your audience is, where they're coming from, who they are, where they live, at the most basic level, because you're really not going to get anywhere unless you have a clear idea of who is going to be coming to your screening, going to your festival, logging onto your streaming service. Like it's all about the audience, and that's what the NFTS really pushes in this course. Of secondary but very important afterwards is, your theoretical underpinnings, your knowledge of the history of what you're trying to screen, where it's positioned in. If you're screening new things, where are they positioned in relation to older films, other forms of art, and that's things you can learn in class, but it is also things you learn just by living life and exploring your own interests by yourself. So it's an important part of the course, but it is a bit secondary to the more practical things. Learning about audiences, where they're coming from. We talk to a lot of industry professionals as part of the course. That's really the core, the foundation of kind of what a lot of our learning comes from, is from people who are doing the work today.
And I'm guessing that's kind of all different types of institutional and commercial levels, because there is so many different types of curation and events and archiving, and all these things kind of tie together in different ways. I mean, it's interesting sort of from a kind of post-pandemic perception. I mean, obviously this course will have been going on before that, but I would imagine that the course maybe is, I mean, I don't know whether you know, but whether it's changed a little bit, because we talk a lot about, the idea of post-pandemic cinema going, and what we tend to mean by that, I think, is mainstream cinema going and the production infrastructure with relationship to streaming and what impact that has on cinema going. I mean, does that form part of, maybe it forms a lot of the conversation that you guys are having now on this course when you're thinking of what cinema engagement is going to be going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. The landscape of cinema going has changed. I mean, I'm certainly not the first to say it. It's just changed drastically. So it's a lot of the considerations we take in curating these projects is, are there alternative methods for engagement? My own grad project is happening at a very established cinema venue in central London. My other course mates have taken alternative routes in how they've programmed their own work. But I think regardless of where you're showing it, there's always, there has to be an eye to alternative methods of engagement. So whether that's being able to program short films on an online platform in conjunction with your physical screenings, or whether you can conduct virtual panels on Zoom to supplement some of your screenings. I think it's a given now that you have to be looking out for these alternative avenues. Because simply going to the cinema, sitting down and watching a film doesn't cut it for some people anymore. Some audiences, that's just not going to be enough. So you have to keep moving with them, which is frustrating sometimes, but it's a challenge that you just have to meet.
I was going to ask that. Do you think that cinema now we have to admit that it's in a position where it's not the mainstream attraction anymore that it once was, and therefore anything outside of big tentpole movies that are essentially a different form of entertainment to, say, repertory cinema or art house cinema. And sometimes, we tend to forget that because we know where to go, especially if you're living in London, to see the stuff that nobody else knows about. But nobody really, outside of the people who are in the know and make the effort to be in the know, have an easy access point to non-mainstream cinema. So is there a sort of underlying acceptance of that now going forward? And therefore, when you're putting on, whether it's film seasons or you're programming in specific venues, you have to kind of expand the scope of access points, let's say, to people who wouldn't ordinarily know where to find this kind of cinema.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head in the first part of that statement. It's that I'm of the mind we have to accept that cinema going as we know it is changed. I mean, maybe it's a bit defeatist, but I think it's changed irrevocably. Like you said, the mainstream cinema going audience is going many fewer times each year. They're seeing the kinds of films that are made in meeting rooms. They're made by boards of directors rather than artists. And
they're going for brands more than the film themselves.
And for going for brands, yes, yeah. For better or for worse, that's just the landscape of film going at the moment. I don't really see it changing, going back to whatever pre-pandemic. I mean, even before the pandemic, it was changing rapidly. The pandemic, I think, sort of just confirmed and facilitated some of these changes that were already in progress. But like you said, I think that just means, and it goes back to the awareness of audience, is that when we are, like I have been programming this very specific season of films for a very specific audience, you have to just be on your game about who exactly what your programming is for. And I had that consideration from the very beginning. I was programming a season of films that I knew exactly who this audience is. And that's why it had to be at the ICA, because I know that audience goes to that cinema and I know their programming very well. And I knew that audience matched the audience that I know exists for the films that I've programmed already in other parts of the world. So you really just have to be extremely specific. Again, it's like specificity in the service of universality, I guess. Maybe that doesn't make sense, but you have to be very specific to accomplish your wider goals, if that makes sense. Right.
Just a quick break here to thank Eric Nilsson for joining us as a Patreon member at the £10 level. We'll be contacting you very soon, Eric, to get your details so we can get your merch to you as quickly as possible. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support truly independent media, please consider becoming a Patreon subscriber for as little as £2 a month. You'll get access to our bonus podcasts, free tickets to our live shows, and the monthly newsletter, which contains an exclusive article and a host of cultural recommendations. We don't use ads on the show, and producing it is a real labour of love, which is why we do it. However, we do have production costs, and we want to continue to improve the quality and expand. So if you have the option to support us financially, we would very much appreciate it. If not, no worries at all, but also sharing and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, or Podchaser is also a great way to support, as is sharing your favourite episodes on your social media networks. And we'll always give you a shout out, of course. But now, back to the show.
So let's talk a little bit about the season that you've programmed. It's called Beyond Interpretation, and looking at the copy on the website now, it explores the connections between paranoia, conspiracy, anxiety, and the precarious realities of artistic creation at the margins of the American film industry. So why don't you explain that a little bit to us? What was your sort of thinking behind that theme?
Yeah, I haven't heard it read out by someone else before. It is a bit of a mouthful, but that it's as concise as I can get those ideas into one sentence. Yeah, so this idea came around, I think, in a general sense, by just an awareness of kind of the insane things happening in the world at the moment. I think early 2022, from an American perspective, seeing kind of from afar all the insane things that were happening, Roe versus Wade was overturned in early 2020. The pandemic was still ongoing, less severely. Everyday sort of political realities were just becoming just almost untenable. It made the political situation in America is so fraught, I would say. So I guess the sense of just observing this all happening made me very aware once again. I mean, and like every sort of era in history has had to contend with fraught political realities, is how is cinema responding to this? So it just necessitated a looking back at cinema history, and particularly American film history. So In the 40s, in the late 40s, you had film noir emerge as a genre in response to millions of American soldiers returning home and finding that the world they once knew was not quite what they remembered. A genre emerges out of that, influenced by, German cinema in the 30s. You have the sort of paranoid American cinema of the 70s that was responding to Vietnam and Watergate, and a hugely drastic shift in like the industrial context of the film industry, where the production code essentially ended in 1967. The studio system as we know it was, if not on its way out, totally out. And corporations were finding their way in to fill those gaps. And I think the cinema that came out of that was a reflection of those sort of anxieties, the precarious nature of making exciting, radical art in a complicated, corporate, money-dependent context. And so that's really how I was approaching looking at film today. I wanted to look at film today, look at how, in what ways marginal American film was responding to the challenges we're facing today, knowing that it's been a tradition in American cinema since the studio system, at least. So that's how I was approaching it. And marginal cinema was really, it had to be cinema from the margins of the industry. I have less and less faith in mainstream American cinema to actually address, the real problems of today. Not that, exciting art can't be made from within the system, and challenging radical art can't be made within the system. But I found, at least for me, it more important to look at art from the outside. And so, so the program of films I came up with is really born out of those concerns. And they're films from first-time filmmakers or filmmakers who have made their second film. They're from people without studio support. They're without personal wealth, people who have used a lot of collective action to make their films work. Two of the films are from the same production company was sort of founded by these three friends who met in college and really share their labor across their films. They each take turns directing films, and it's done with this really necessary collective mindset.
Do you see a difference that you talked about marginal cinema and independent cinema? Are you making a very specific difference there? Because I think one of the issues with independent cinema, as you see it, may be reflected in Sundance or something like that. And then particularly the way that the discourse around particular filmmakers who have moved from what quote unquote would be independent into more mainstream filmmaking. It seems that now independent cinema in America, particularly in an American context, is just seen as a sort of feeder system, to use a baseball analogy, to a farm school for American filmmaking. So is that the distinction that you're making with what you're calling there marginal film?
Yeah, I think that's something I'm doing maybe subconsciously. I'm not trying to call out the American independent film industry, which I agree from what you're saying is I look at what is maybe deemed independent film from America today and raise an eyebrow when you have Netflix productions able to compete for the Independent Spirit Awards in America. I have to raise an eyebrow or two, because it's like, with Netflix behind you, how independent are you really? Sure, maybe your film was made for less than $20 million, but let's look at this frankly. What is independent about this film? And I think, not just to call out Netflix, no matter how much I like to call out Netflix, it's a trend that's going through paradoxical mainstream independent film, which I think my films very much are apart from. I haven't asked my directors what the budgets of their films were, but they weren't made for much. The first film in my program, Slow Machine, was made piecemeal across essentially 3.5 years with inconsistent grant money on weekends. So it's that's a far cry from your no bound back Netflix production, which maybe isn't made for too much money, but it's got a machine behind it. There's no machine behind any of my films that I'm programming.
We're talking more about production processes rather than aesthetic sensibilities, I think.
Yeah.
Because historically, I think that there were independent cinema and studio cinema could be almost seen on the screen. The distinction between the two was there in the aesthetic a lot more, whereas today, because of what you could argue is the democratization of the internet and technology and digital culture more broadly has made it easier to bring together what is completely high-end. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know that CGI costs an awful lot of money, but what's interesting is there's so many, the technology around fake imagery and fake sound now is quite easy to access if you've got the know-how. So you don't see it on screen, but where you do feel it, I think, is in things like the support for production and then the marketing that goes alongside, and then the exhibition, the possibilities of exhibition. So which is why sort of programs like this are so important,
Yeah, I'm much more. I mean, I'm of course, interested in the aesthetics, and all 5 of the films in my grad project have their own distinct visual language. But I'm also really, really interested in sort of the industrial context in which these films are made. A lot of these films were, made with crowdfunders, and, the generosity of maybe bigger names who happen to be in the films. There are a couple films with bigger names that are bigger than the film, that if a bigger star believes in this tiny production, that can make a big difference, especially when you don't have a studio or a big production house or distribution house behind you to make it a success. So yeah. I'm really interested in these sort of production contexts, the industry context that I believe has had a sort of indirect effect on the visual language of the films. I think a lot of the films visually are, commenting on the kind of context in which they were made.
Yeah. I mean, you made an interesting point before about the anxiety of the nature of art in a capitalist system, and I think that the element of paranoia and anxiety, we could talk about that in a broader scope, and we'll touch on that in a second. But then it leads on from what we talked about before about what is independent cinema in an age where anybody with a phone, and an internet connection can kind of call themselves an independent creator. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's really interesting having what has a very long-standing historical legacy in terms of, subcultural film or anti-capitalist political filmmaking, or grassroots digital filmmaking. All of these kinds of things, I think, were created in a sense to make challenges to the way that commercialization is in its impact on art, let's say. But I think what's interesting now is it's almost as if even if you're at a grassroots level, everybody's looking to monetize like straight away. So you know what I mean? And it's interesting then how that sits within that history of independent cinema, which really the aim was never for these things to make money, really,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I interviewed the directors of the opening film in my grad project, Slow Machine. Their names are Paul Felton and Joe DiNardo. And Paul said to me something that has really stuck with me. He said that the film the film's kind of attitude and tone reflects his own feelings of the antagonism of the industry to the art he wants to make. And what you said about, the democratization of like technology, I think if anything, maybe it's the more people do sort of pick up their phone and try and make a movie, the more power that gives to the idea of an independent artist. I don't think this is really the situation where more people doing it dilutes its importance. I think if anything, the more people do it, the more important it is.
But would you not say, though, if everyone then is making 1-minute TikTok videos that, we have to troll through, it's like, where is a boundary and a shape of artistic creation that is not just more and more additions to because the corporations don't care what's on there. They just care that something is on there, and therefore it's reproducing that infrastructure, let's say. I know there's no answer to that, so I don't know why.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say I don't have an answer for that, but I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, there is a difference, but I mean, I wish I had an answer for that. I'd probably I don't know. I'd probably make a lot of money with that, with being able to solve that. I don't know. Again, another way to monetize, but
it's a paradox.
It's a huge, frustrating paradox. But I guess at least in the context of the program I'm putting on, the films were made really outside of like this, of the capitalist logic of profit. I've spoken to almost every director, and their aims are to make the art that just like sets their soul on fire. And that's what I hope the films convey to the audiences who come to the screenings, because these films kind of set my soul on fire. And it's in part because of what they're kind of standing for. And it's not always explicit. I think with Paul and Joe's film Slow Machine, a lot of this sort of resistance is explicit, and they're like, yeah, this is like a middle finger to the system. With some of the other films, it's not necessarily that, but you can see it in the bones of these films, that they're made, whether intentionally or not, their mere existence is a form of like resistance to the powers that be.
So just on the program itself, then you've got two films that we've seen on the Cinematologist and commented on. Yeah. I mean, Happa's comment is one, because we did the episode with Taylor Taormina. Yeah. So people can go back and listen to that before they go to your screenings.
Yes, highly recommend.
Yeah, and then there's Amy Seimetz's second feature, which is She Dies Tomorrow, which is a great film, and one of the reasons I love that is because it's got one of the most enigmatic actors working today, Caitlin Sheil, who seems to be a very clearly an independent, a figure, a sort of presence in independent cinema. But I'm really am interested, and I think maybe this is because my undergraduate dissertation was about conspiracy films of the 1970s. So you've already mentioned Slow Machine, which is the opening film, which is about an out-of-work actress who meets a counter-terrorism agent, and there's some weird, vision of what it means to be a creative in that sense. But the one that really gets my juices flowing in terms of, I've already bought a ticket for it, is Topology of Sirens. So just reading the description, a woman discovers a collection of cryptic cassette tapes in her aunt's old house, propelling her on a sonic investigation for answers. With hints of Antonioni and 90s computer games, the UK premiere of Jonathan Davis's first feature immerses us in the sounds and stillness of an underseen version of Los Angeles. That ticks all of my boxes for sure.
Yeah, I'm so glad that that's the one that has caught your attention, because I fear, and maybe I don't want to speak this fear into existence, but I'll say it anyways, I fear that might be the one that people dismiss because it is it's the outlier, I would say, in this whole season in terms of its relationship to paranoia and conspiracy and anxiety. I would say it's the outlier, but I think it's incredibly rewarding to watch with these things in mind, because if anything, like, when I was talking to Jonathan, these are like concerns and interests of his that I think are buried like much deeper within him than he was necessarily explicitly trying to say with the film. But in talking to him about my interests in the way I was watching the film, he saw what I was getting at, even though they weren't necessarily his most direct concerns when he was making it. He saw it within it. He was able to latch onto my own reading of the film and saw what I was going for, and which is why he's also very excited for this screening. So I'm really glad you said shout out Topology of Sirens. It's a really great one. Think of Antonioni's. Yeah, I mean, like I said in my little description, it's like it's Blowout meets 90s point and click adventure computer game. Yeah, with this, or maybe more. Yeah, maybe more blow out instead of blow up, because it is all about sound instead of images, at least, although the film has many beautiful images and is composed wonderfully. But yeah, it's I'm glad you mentioned it.
The last film on the list is called The Plagiarists. You want to say something about that one?
Oh, what to say about that? This is, if anything, I think this is what I'm most excited for people to see. It is one of the most thought-provoking, strange films I've seen in a very, very, very long time. What I'll say about it is that it follows a mildly nightmarish couple, a sort of Brooklyn artistic couple, white couple, as they are stranded sort of in the snow in a suburb after visiting their friend. And this guy, Clip, comes to help them after their car breaks down, and they spend the night at his house when they wait for the mechanic to fix their car. That's really the setup for it, and their sort of chance meeting really throws this couple's sort of perception of self, their perception of the art they make, and the perception of the way they see the world. This chance meeting really throws that all into chaos for very interesting reasons, and through in a very perplexing sort of cinematic modes. So that's all I'll say. It's really, really amazing, and it's made by, written and produced by this pair of filmmakers, visual artists, James Keenitz Wilkins and Robin Chavoir, who this is their kind of most commercial, I would say, film endeavor. They mostly do sort of artist moving image that appears in a lot of galleries. So this is, and they would agree, this is their most commercial sort of film endeavor. But it is far from any sort of mainstream, even for it's a mainstream attempt for them. But it just goes to show how kind of out of left field they are, because it is it's probably the most radical film in this program.
Right. Just in terms then of the connecting tissue, you've talked a little bit about, some of the contexts of how these films might sit adjacently to each other, but also how they might all reflect a certain mood in American society right now. And, like I said, that sort of, there's always been paranoia or conspiracy films in American cinema, but there was a definite cycle in the 70s. There was a definite cycle kind of mid to late 90s and into the 2000s. But it just seems now everything is either paranoia or dystopia, and it in some ways you could say that independent cinema is inherently progressive and leftist in its politics, but also I think that there is a sort of level of hopelessness in a lot of the cinema that we see right now, like that it's just a kind of overwhelming sense of what is going on around us, and we can't figure things out. And it seems that is a mood within cinema. I think that you would say that is independent, or that is trying to have some kind of political commentary on it. I mean, I don't know. Would you say that these films fit into that kind of context, let's say?
I think in a sense, but I think that the films that I've programmed are actually far more optimistic than maybe people coming into these screenings would expect them to be. And it was not by design on my part. It's purely been just because the films happen to be that way, and I've felt the films really fit my sort of aims. And I think maybe it would be hard to classify them as purely optimistic films, because they do, I think, engage with a lot of the negativity of the world. But I think I think they'll surprise people in just how ambiguous they are about maybe just the doomed state of the world. As much as the films really are trying to explicitly say something about the doomed state of the world, which I don't necessarily think they are, it really is, like you said, tapping into a much more sort of elusive mood, rather than than trying to make a concrete statement about, quote unquote, the times we live in, which I find those films far less interesting, because they're usually quite didactic, which is inherently conservative. And these films are not conservative. They're extremely progressive films, and I think that's because of their ambiguity. There's ambiguity and progressiveness, I think, are inherent, because I think, and progressive, I mean, it's at least to me, progressiveness is a positive. There's a positive connotation to the word progression. I mean, it's forward momentum. It's looking ahead. And so I think actually maybe I would push back on like the dystopian nature of like leftist film. I think leftist film has to have optimism. I think it's a core concept that it has to engage with. And each of these films has a bit of that.
Yeah. I guess so. And maybe it's far too reductive to say there is sort of conservative and liberal filmmaking as a kind of matter of course, because there's so many complicated things. There's so many dystopian films that are about revolutions that are really quite conservative if you think about it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course.
So yeah, I mean, congratulations on the season. It starts on the 12th of January. Is that right, at the ICA?
Yeah, the 12th of January running through the 19th. The screenings are taking place on the 12th, the 14th, the 15th, the 17th, and the 19th. And you can book tickets.
And you can book tickets at the ICA website?
Through the ICA website, ica.art, and you can find the program, I guess, maybe by searching on their website, but you can also book tickets through the link tree in any of the social media for the grad project, for the project as well.
Great. Well, I'll put the link up on our show notes as well. So anybody listening, just go to our front page and you can click through from there. So what's the plan then, apart from graduating with, distinction? Not to put any pressure on you or anything. Do you want to get into kind of programming and working in film festivals or working in institutions? What's the plan, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That would be a great scenario to find myself in. I'm really grappling with the reality that film programming won't be what I do full time. It's just the nature of the industry. The jobs are not there. So I'm really sort of assessing how I'll approach this. But there are jobs out there, and so I'm applying for them, trying to get my foot in wherever I can. But yeah, I mean, whatever it takes me, I would love to keep Beyond Interpretation going in some kind of form, whether it is a chance to do screenings on a semi-regular basis that really engage with these ideas, because I think the part of the industry that I'm engaging with is going to keep making these types of films, and I think there's a sort of a hole that I hope this project is filling, like an audience hole that this project is filling by, bringing these American films, across the pond, because I think the parallels of the political situations our countries find themselves in are quite similar, and I hope they resonate. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and hopefully the audiences will come, and I'm looking forward to going myself. So thanks for coming on, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me.